Okay, I think we might get started. Welcome everybody, and thank you for attending our session today on green spaces and health, presented by World Health Organization. I'd like to introduce you to a number of speakers we have in this session. We have Nathalie Robel is with the World Health Organization, the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health. And then we have speaking on green spaces and health, the Green UR project. Dr. Pierre Moudou is also with Living and Working Environments, World Health Organization, European Centre for Environment and Health, and the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health in WHO headquarters. We have speaking on green and blue are for you, but when do they work best? A systemic review of the effects of specific types and characteristics of green and blue space on mental health is Femke Boot. And I do apologize if I get these names wrong. It's my good Australian accent. Green spaces and air pollution, insights on an ongoing review work by Aunt Dina, who is a World Health Organization consultant. And conclusions will be wrapped up by Dorota Jarakosinka. I apologize, Dorota. So, as I said, welcome everybody, and I will hand over now to Nathalie, who will start her introduction and introduce her speakers.
Thank you very much, and dear colleagues, it's a really great pleasure to be here today, and on behalf of all WHO colleagues, I would like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to join this event. And the event is particularly relevant for us because colleagues who are part of the discussions and are managing, the urban green spaces and parks firsthand are, from a health perspective, to be considered as the true, public health practitioners on the ground. So it really offers the opportunity for strengths and exchange and collaboration. There is no doubt that the effects of green spaces on health have been increasingly attracting attention, both politically and within research activities. And the results of several research projects so far have been, converging towards the existence of a quantifiable association of the effects of green spaces on health. And indeed, if we look at the opportunities that do exist at the urban scale to protect and promote health, we do see that urban green areas offer opportunity for positive change and also for sustainable development in our cities. And actually, in this context, the social and also economic benefits of green spaces are equally important and need to be mentioned. So I think that the fact that there's on one hand a recognition that green spaces are seen as a public health intervention, but also the fact that there has been an increased recognition that the health sector can play a role has led WHO to scale up and also diversify the technical and the governance support to member states. And we will have the opportunity during this session to deep dive in some of the concrete work. But I would like to take the opportunity in a couple of sentences to give some strategic developments and also to highlight some of the diversified entry points that we have been working on. The first, I would say, is that there is an increased recognition of green spaces within the strategic advice that WHO is giving to its countries. So not only green spaces, for example, are mentioned within the strategy on health, environment, and climate change, and I think we would all expect it to be there, but actually green spaces are also part of other specific strategies, like the aging strategy, for example, where a specific goal is, highlighting the importance of green spaces for the elderly population. The second one is that there has been also an increased work towards integrating health within the broad SDG agenda, but also very specifically within the Global Sustainable Urban Agenda during UN Habitat 3, for example. And this has been, a very concrete strategic shift. The third one would be that a lot of core work has also been moving towards looking at the evidence base about the health effects of green spaces on health, and but also effects and impact, effectiveness and impact of interventions. And our colleagues in the Bonn office have been leading on this for many years now, coming up also, you know, with concrete recommendations and guidance and also publications. And we will also be looking, you know, in this session will be really giving us the opportunity to look at, for example, closer links between green spaces and air pollution, but on the other hand, specific health outcomes like mental health. The last entry point I would like to highlight is also the recognition of the role of green spaces within urban and territorial planning processes and the role for health. And there is a need for the provision of concrete tools to help to quantify the impacts of green spaces for health. Policymakers need that to take action. And Pierre will be speaking about one of those tools. And the other one is that, for example, WHO just launched a source book on how to integrate health and urban planning. And one of those entry points that has been identified there is the fact of using green spaces as an entry point. So I think that all these activities are a testimony of a range of scientific and also policy areas that is evolving and diversifying. And I just would like to conclude by mentioning that certainly there are still a lot of issues that are outstanding and do require future work. And I think that this forum will certainly help to drive the agenda. So for example, there is still some question about the definition of green spaces, or a lot of the science comes from the global north. And finally, also when looking at health impacts, we need to look at also accessibility, but also quality, for example, of green spaces. So all this to say that there is a lot of work to be done, but it should be like a motivation, you know, to roll up our sleeves. And with that, I would really like to hand over to my colleagues and Pierre in particular for presenting some of the work, particularly around Green UR. And I would like to thank you once again for having us all here. So over to you, Pierre.
Thank you, Natalie. I share my screen and just want to know if you can see my PowerPoint. Is it visible?
Yes.
It is.
Yeah, okay. I have a presentation where I want to go through basically give you a very quick overview of some of the work that Natalie was presenting before, that in particular the European Center for Environment and Health has been developing in the last 10 years. And there are three basically leading questions that have been, I would say, promoted a lot of different studies, interventions, activities. And the first one is related to the evidence of the effects of green space on health. So that's the first question, and I will go through it, I would say, quickly. And the other point is the fact that we face a lot of challenges when we have to estimate the impact of green space on health. And this is something that I will show you through a project for a tool that we have been developing and using also mostly for educational purposes, but I would say the purpose of the tool, it can be extended also to discussion with planners for different uses. I will show this very quickly. So the evidence of the health effects of green spaces. It's very interesting. This is a paper that was out very recently. The fact that now we have around 2,000 papers a year in which the green space is and health are investigated, and the relevance of what I'm showing is the fact that basically there is not, as in the past, a single scholar or some expert that can master the whole discipline. It has always been a multidisciplinary area of work, and the fact that we have now so many people working in the area, publishing in the scientific journals, give us also not only the weakness of the impossibility to master what is published, but also the strength of the many hundreds of people that are involved in this work. And I was mentioning the fact of evidence, and if we do not take decisions based on evidence, it's very hard. If we do not quantify, if we do not measure, it is very difficult to monitor and to plan. So one of the most important, I think, work that has been carried out in the last few years has been the systematic reviews, has been studies, and also longitudinal and cohort studies that have been carefully investigated the effects of green space on mortality in general, and also on some specific health outcomes, as mentioned before, like mental health and diabetes, and improved pregnancy outcomes, and in the population that are exposed to green spaces. So we have different patterns where green spaces are affecting our health. One is on mental health, for example, and another one is on mortality. And mortality, usually we need to have very robust numbers, and numbers that are related to cohort studies. And we have been working also on systematic review of cohort studies recently. And all this work is important. Before moving to how to operationalize the work, this is one way to operationalize what we are putting together, is the fact that we want to give some key messages for people working in on urban green spaces. And with the colleague Matthias Braubach that is in Bonn, we have been working first on an overview of the evidence that we have on green spaces and health, and then how we can translate this in suggestions for the people that are working every day on when taking decisions on green spaces interventions. And so we have published an Urban Green Spaces Brief for Action that is also translated in Russian, that is an official language of WHO, but has been also translated by in other languages. And this gives you an idea of the interest, as Natalie was saying, about the topic. All this, the interest as basically for WHO has been a huge challenge. And the challenge is, as already mentioned, one of the first challenges is how to define urban green space. And the second challenge is which indicator are the best to measure green space. And then the third one is the relation between green space and health. That is not a straightforward relation, because there's a lot of indirect mechanisms that put green space in relation to health. And then there are other questions that we have received about the minimum threshold levels for exposure, and how much interventions are good in promoting also other health benefits, such physical, for example, physical activity, so more active physical activity, and also different social behaviors like fostering social cohesions. I will give you a very quick now example in a minute about how we can work on these issues from different perspectives. And one of the perspectives that we have taken is the one on addressing the interventions and the policymakers' way of putting together the evidence and understanding the evidence. And I was showing before some reports. Another thing is that it's important to think how the planners, how the people working in reality managing urban parks are, and the decision makers are thinking. And they usually think obviously in spatial terms. So we have created a plugin for QGIS that is a free software, GIS software, that gives an idea of how complex is this relation, but the fact that we, in this complex relation between green space and health, we can, we have space to promote a lot of public health policies. So this tool that I'm going to show you very quickly is based on a GIS, and I wonder if you see my screen. I am launching the tool for really a 2 minutes demonstration. Team, can you see the screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'm showing quickly Barcelona. The most important thing when you work in the area of quantifying the health effects, the health impacts of green spaces, is the fact that you need to define your area. So first element. The second element, you need to have a population that is living in this area. And the third element is you need to define what your definition of green space. So I'm going very quickly, but this is the core of the discussion that you can have with planners. Like are cemetery green spaces, are sport settings be considered as green spaces if they have trees, all those kind of things. And then you have different sources for green spaces. You can have cadastral maps, you can have master plan maps, you can have NDVI from satellite, you have Google, OpenStreetMap, etc. But the most important thing is that once you have the green spaces, you can start thinking about, okay, one thing that is important in understanding the exposure, how many people are living in within a particular space. And another thing is thinking, okay, well, but there are a lot of mediated mechanisms. So there are trees that are responsible for a lot of different effects. Then there is effects on temperature, cooling and heating. There are effects on air pollution and noise and on pollen, just to give you a very brief survey of the ecosystem services. But one of the first questions that we got years ago, it was about how much green space are people experiencing in their city. I have here the case of Barcelona, and I'm going quickly, and the total study area is 100 square meters. We know how much green space is there. And then knowing this, so we know the percentage of green space in the city is quite low. In any case, we can calculate how many people are living in a buffer of 300 meters. There's a lot of discussions about how good are indicators like 300 meters or 200 meters or 5 minutes walking, 10 minutes walking. I don't want to enter in this, but it's important to have this discussion. So to have an idea that you can map how many people are living in a city like Barcelona, 300-meter distance from a green space. At the moment that you have done that kind of calculation, you can also do model scenarios if you want, or so you can increase or decrease the level of green space in the city, or you can say, okay, with this level of green space, let's see, knowing the relative risk that I have from epidemiological studies, if I can calculate the mortality that is reduced because of this exposure to green space. So I have run a very quick now demonstration of a simple calculation that is not so simple. Here, the cardiovascular mortality is 10. So 10 people we can think are premature mortality that is not happening because of the exposure of green space. And I'm sharing again screens. Now I have PDF. I have tried basically here to reproduce the results of a scientific paper that it was published 3 years ago by Müller et al., in which there was a calculation of the green space of Barcelona. And then in another paper, there was also calculation of the impact on mortality, that is here. So you can see that there are some calculation using risk. I go back to the presentation because I am concluding, and there are two things that I just want to say. We are working on this tool in order to have people testing it and helping us doing the test. And we want to use the best evidence to inform the tool that is mainly educational. So to introduce people to understand this complexity of green space effects on health. so we are reviewing a lot of literature, and we are asking scientists to do this review. We are helping them with funds and suggestions and recommendations to do some research. And the other thing is that with this work, WHO wants to really to have the public health experts and the people working in public health playing a different role when they are facing the planners and the people that are working in the urban parks area. So this is, I think, the core of the work, of some of the work that we are doing that I have presented. And I think that the next presentation will go more in detail about the use of evidence and the way we build systematic reviews with FEMKE. Thank you.
Okay, next presenter, we got FEMKE. Yeah.
Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
You're good to go.
Okay. So today I'm going to talk about some work that I'm presenting on behalf of the Expert Working Group Biodiversity and Mental Health, which is a project that has been conducted as an ECLIPSE project with co-financing from the WHO. The ECLIPSE is quite a special project within Horizon 2020. It is aimed to transfer knowledge from science to the practice. And here people can give their request to the ECLIPSE Bureau, and as a response there will be a call for experts. So in this case it was the French Ministry of Environment that really wanted to know which types of green and blue space influence mental health most. And that was in March 2017, there was a call for experts. An expert working group was formed. And we decided to do a systematic review, and actually 2 systematic reviews to answer this question. That report has now been written. It has been going through an external review process, and it will be published next week or the week after that. So we performed 2 systematic reviews, and today I will present both, but the focus will be mostly on green spaces. As the blue space systematic review unfortunately did not reveal that much new insights. For both reviews, we've based our synthesis on a conceptual model adapted from both Bradman and colleagues and Markovic and colleagues, because we focus on elements of the natural environment. So in our case, it's green space types and green space characteristics. And we're looking at how this influences the amount of exposure that people get of green spaces and the characteristics of these exposures. So is it incidental or purposeful, the type of activity? Because the experiences that people have in green spaces may moderate the effects of these spaces on mental health. For instance, if you have a short visit but with a very good experience, that may have the same effect as a very long visit but with a less pronounced positive experience. And this is all influenced by what you do and how you perceive this environment. And we believe that in this respect, the types of green space and the qualities of this green space are very important. The bottom half of the model is based on Markovic, and this explains the pathways through which a green space is thought to influence mental health. So is this, on the one hand, mitigation of negative effects of the environment, such as air pollution or urban heat island. The second pathway is through restoration, so it helps you recover depleted resources. It helps to reduce stress. And the third pathway is instauration, and this is more focused on building resources, for instance, becoming more physically fit by a physical exercise, or by building a social network which helps you face for future stresses better. We performed our systematic reviews according to the PRISMA protocol. And as I said, I will start with the green systematic review. And as you can see, it revealed quite a substantial amount of papers, 134. This was also quite a challenge to extract results from. We had 67 experimental, 55 cross-sectional or longitudinal papers, and we also included qualitative papers, and then for this review we had 12. And before looking at the outcomes of these papers, we first categorized them, and we used this categorization with 7 different green space types. So we have the urban green space, which was more a mix of urban green space. So some studies looked, for instance, at playgrounds and allotments, and not specifically at one type. The second one is the park. I think we all know the garden. This could be either a public or a private garden. The fourth category is forest and woodland. Then we have grassland and meadows. A lot of, especially cross-sectional studies looked at trees, tree canopy, for instance. And biodiversity was the only green space characteristic that was substantial enough to get its own category. And besides these 7 categories, there was also a miscellaneous category with studies that did not fall into these 7 main categories. And as you can see, most studies focused on the park and the forest, followed by trees and other plants and the urban space category. Now our focus was on which green space type or green space quality performs best. And in order to do so, we need to make a comparison. Unfortunately, not all papers enabled a direct comparison. So we had a number of studies where we found effects, for instance, we saw effects, for instance, on the forest, on mental health. And we had to indirectly compare this with other studies by looking at the direction of the outcome and the effect size of the outcome. But as you can see in this graph, the papers that did allow for a comparison, so these were papers that had, for instance, and the park and the forest and a garden in the same study. That was mostly in the cross-sectional paper category. Whereas the experimental studies mostly focused on the park and woodland. We also distinguished between quite a great deal of different mental health outcomes, 14 in total. And here you can see that the experimental category mainly focused on affect and physiological stress, whereas the cross-sectional papers were a little bit more scattered, with most focus on subjective well-being and mental health. But I think this picture maybe already starts to show you how complex the data was that we had. And if not, then this table might do, because the outcomes were highly scattered, scattered across different green space types, but also scattered across different mental health outcomes. And this really made it difficult to make firm conclusions. And this is also often mentioned in previous systematic reviews. Now in this graph, this is the overview of the results that we found for the experimental studies. We have positive effects, which is the plus. We have the square, which is no effect, and we have the minus, which is a negative effect. Here we can see that in general, the effects were relatively positive. And there were also some negative effects reported here. And it's important to realize, if you look at this table, that that studies often use multiple measures. So they used, for instance, affect and physiological stress, but they also used multiple measures within one category. So for physiological stress, for instance, it could be heart rate and blood pressure. As you know, outcomes are not always very consistent. So it could be that heart rate showed a positive effect and there was no effect of blood pressure. So that that's also, and both outcomes are included in this table. So this makes it very scattered. And this is the same table, but for the cross-sectional studies and longitudinal studies. It shows quite a similar pattern, maybe even more scattered. And here you can see that the focus of the cross-sectional studies were more on the long-term mental health outcomes, whereas in the experimental studies the focus was more on short-term outcomes. In general, for most green space types, again here you can also see that effects were mostly positive, predominantly positive. Now it is 10 minutes is too short to go into detail of the outcomes of this systematic review because it was quite big. But I'm now going to present some of the general and overall conclusions that we had. So again, we saw general positive effects of urban green space parks, forests, grassland, gardens, but also from trees, and that's I think quite an important finding. So it's not very only the designated green space types within the city that are beneficial, but also the street trees and the vegetation on street level. So you know, these give potential for these micro restorative experiences, and they're also very important to take into account. There was only one category where we found negative effects, and that was dense vegetation. In general, more dense vegetation seemed to lead to worse mental health. So and that was also an important outcome. Now, looking at the comparisons, as I mentioned earlier, we couldn't make all the comparisons directly, so some of them had to be made indirectly. There were a number of studies that compared species types, so that went really into detail, and for instance looked at roadside trees and different types of roadside trees. Those studies in general did not find any differences, whereas we did find some inkling that higher levels of biodiversity was related with better mental health. But in general, the comparisons showed highly mixed results. We could not declare a clear winner. Maybe we also did not expect that, but there was no clear winner. Sometimes the park scored better than, for instance, grassland, and sometimes it was the other way around. And to illustrate this, I have an example for the park versus the forest. This comparison was made most often. And here we find that in the experimental studies, the forest always scored better than the park. So these were all studies where people were taken out to the forest and to the park, and then their effect and often also their physiological responses were measured. And in these studies, the forest often almost always scored better than the park. I must also note that these studies were often conducted in either Asia or Finland. So it was also not very scattered across Europe or the world. The cross-sectional studies, looking more at long-term health outcomes, mental health, and things like that, had less studies than the experimental category. But here they find very consistently the opposite pattern. Here, the park scored better than the forest. And this really triggered some thoughts. There was a little bit of fuel for thoughts, because it seems that what we're missing here is effects of actual exposure. So in the experimental studies, the participants were taking to a visit. It was a short-term visit with measurements of short-term outcomes, whereas in the cross-sectional studies, we were looking at proximity and availability, so pretty much like the example that Pierre just gave, and looking at that as a proxy of real exposure. But taking people to a field study does not always reflect reality. The participants in those experiments may never come in these environments in real life, whereas living closer to a park does not automatically mean that you also visit that. So we feel that these studies really point at that we need to know more about actual exposure. How often do people go to these parks, and how long, and also what are they doing there, and what are the differences that people have. So this is really getting back a little bit on the Bradman model, that we need to know more about the amount of exposure, but also about the experience in exposure. Because we don't know why these differences in outcomes have been found between cross-sectional and experimental papers. So as I mentioned, we also did a systematic review on blue spaces. Here we only found 24 papers, with the oldest one from 2013, 7 experimental, 12 cross-sectional, and 6 qualitative. Here, where we had a little bit of a problem with a lot of heterogeneity in the green space review, we were lacking it in the blue space. So the papers were mostly only looking at coast of the sea, and only few at inland waters. Too few were actually looking at inland waters, and also we were lacking most of the categories in that blue space type. So we couldn't really formulate firm conclusions here. And another problem was that the majority of the studies were conducted in the UK, and also by a single group. So this really is pretty much a research field that is still emerging. I think these outcomes really point at the need to do more research into blue space types. So as I mentioned, a lot of the inland water categories were not represented in this review. The preliminary findings point at more pronounced effects of the coast than for inland waters. The qualitative papers here did give a little bit of a richness to the outcomes, in saying that it is mostly the sense of space that blue space gives us, and the dynamics in the water, and the tides and the waves and things floating by as important factors of these beneficial effects of blue space. And they also point at the sense of safety that they may mediate these benefits. For instance, all the elderly people were often afraid to slip and fall into the water, and parents with young children were also afraid that children would fall into the water, which kind of hampered their restorative effects at those places. So for the overall conclusions, we've seen that most green and blue space types are beneficial, and this is in line with previous results. Whereas dense vegetation may have a different, a negative association with mental health. But in general, we really need more studies looking at direct comparisons, and also looking at that it is important to look at actual exposure and actual experience that people have in these environments. So all green space matters, but we couldn't declare a definite winner of this tape. It's better to have a park than a forest, for instance. So these are the people that worked on this project, and I think it's now time for the next speaker, looking at mitigating effects of green space air pollution.
Okay, thank you, Femke. So I'll take it from here, and I also will share my screen. Okay.
Femke, yeah, Femke needs to unshare. Yep.
Okay. So, green spaces and air pollution. Well, I guess the green spaces are now the most popular recreational area in cities, at least in COVID times, and they are going against air pollution, which we have found is in many cities around the world, and at least for Europe, it is the most critical environmental health risk, with 4 million premature deaths associated with air pollution, outdoor air pollution every year. So we are looking into this in a review that looks at the mechanisms between green spaces and ambient air pollution. So as you are an audience related to urban parks, I'm wondering how many of you are thinking of air pollution as you would think about, garbage cans, or having your park look nice in terms of vegetation, or access to safe drinking water. I mean, I would be surprised if you had, you may have in Central Park 700 garbage cans and a lot of staff involved in picking up solid waste. But how many staff do you have in managing air pollution, all these pollutants in the air that are invisible? So yeah, it's a question that we don't look at very commonly. It's an invisible risk, but green spaces do have an association with it, and we want to find out if green spaces have more to put against air pollution than a lucky punch. So the review is one that goes across disciplines, not only epidemiology, but looking at environmental sciences, people doing complex models in their basement, others doing multi-year studies with air pollution sensors, or also experimental studies in the lab. We found about 5,000 studies that tackle green spaces and air pollution. Here looking at particulate matter, which is solid or liquid airborne particles, which are the by far largest health risk from air pollution. And we look at them with a focus on the health relevance of studies, and also whether studies show any leverages that we could use. So any mechanisms that possibly you as urban park managers or stakeholders could be using. So let's go through the first round. The first possible measure that vegetation in an urban park or in a different green space setting could take is so-called dispersion. So a blockage of pollution, ideally from point or line sources like a road, and then you have vegetation blocking that pollution from entering areas where, for example, in your park, people are doing sports or having other recreational activities. And there are quite a few studies on that, and we find preliminary that especially dense and thick vegetation that reaches from the ground all the way to about the height of a person. So as Femke said, vegetation that is not as good for mental health, but for air pollution. And we're not saying this should be done in all parts of your park, but where you may have pollutant concentration from a road or something, dense, evergreen, and pollution-resistant vegetation can be reducing air pollution by up to 70–80%. So that's in concentration. So there are significant potentials. They differ between climates and so on. But yeah, if they're placed near the source and seamlessly, so without big gaps, as you see on the left top side between these trees, then there's quite a potential that can be tapped in here. Okay, second round, or excuse me. I wanted to compare this dispersion finding with one current guidance on how to design urban vegetation. And there are good practices that match the recommendation from these articles. I mean, already pollution resilient vegetation is proposed, and placing it close to the source. But the fact that it should be evergreen, dense and thick, and seamlessly integrated would be something new, for example, now in this planning tool that is from 2016. Okay, now the second round. So most of the articles of these 5,000, they tackle the issue of deposition. So that's not simply a particle falling on a leaf and staying there. No, it's more complicated. There are things like Brownian diffusion and Brownian trees, so very small particles that attach with certain chemical bindings to a leaf, or even also to a bark of a tree. As you see here on the right side, where the hairs of a leaf have captured temporarily sometimes, or for longer term, small particles. And what we have found, or what the research suggests, is that especially on days where there is a very high pollutant concentrations, these plants are able to deposit more pollution, so possibly cutting those peaks. And exactly those peaks are responsible for short-term mortality. So we see on a health side, we see on days with a very high pollutant concentrations, and following this pollutant concentration, the days afterwards, we see a higher short-term mortality. So that's a second punch that green spaces could give to air pollution. Good practices, for example, are porous setups of plants so that wind and rain can also take off the air pollution again from the plants, and then the plants can be recharged and take up new air pollution. And of course, it should be downwind of the pollution so that it can stop it before it enters areas where more people are exposed. Okay, the third round is one that is, let's say, most experimental. There are very fascinating studies on how certain plants can absorb certain pollutants. So if we think of all the air pollutants, there, in a liter of air, there are more than 1 million particles. And some of these particles have shown to have a higher health hazard. So, I mean, like the HIV among viruses or the COVID among viruses. So some of these pollutants one may tackle with certain plants. So for example, there are studies that look at lipophilic versus hydrophilic particles, and they also look at particles that have that are charged and that have a magnetic adsorption or adherence to the plant. And those are then very specific interventions for very specific pollution sources or pollution types. There's quite a lot of more research or more analysis that has to go into this, but it's a very interesting field, as this could tackle pollutants that have the highest health risks. Also thinking, for example, of diesel soot, that is always a political issue. So overall, if we think of air pollution and an urban park, we will have health impacts on a local level. So in the park, one can think of a protection of the activities there, especially if people do sports, they inhale more air. So a protection of the quality of air there is more important than in other settings. And as we saw with these, for example, dense hedges, there are a few possibilities where one can reduce the pollutant ingress quite significantly, and also on the district level. So looking at a dimension, possibly also on a city level, as Pierre has introduced with Green UR, there larger green spaces or urban parks can play a role in managing the air quality in the city. And the findings of this review hopefully can also inform the further development of the Green UR tool. Okay, so back to the entry slide. It's not as simple as putting up garbage cans, definitely not, but there are a couple of interventions where green spaces or urban parks can affect air pollution, protecting the people and activities in the park, for example, by making sure that pollution is kept out of the park, also making sure that the park can really use its potential to deposit pollution, and then also take this pollution up into the ecosystem cycle and degrade it depending on the pollutant type. And then the third aspect, the more experimental one, that I would call defanging, so taking out the most hazardous aspects or hazardous components of the particles in the air. That's a third option. And yeah, we'll continue in this review to try and consolidate practical advice from these largely environmental science research. And on my last slide, I I have put my contact, because we're really interested in hearing how this resonates with you and what inputs you would need when thinking about your park and air quality. So thank you very much. And I think I hand over to Dorota for closing remarks or for a discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, 50 minutes passed, we believe, very fast, with really few snapshots of the evidence on perspectives of the value of green space for health, either directly linking it to mental health through the role of green space in improving locally air quality, and also these emerging methods, how we can really translate this evidence, this information into something that can be picked up by the experts, by professionals in urban planning, the community, like the main audience of this Congress, people working with the parks, and how to bring this health argument to the discussion in other professional communities. And in fact, yeah, it may not yet be very obvious to everyone that parks, green spaces may be one more public health instrument, but indeed it is the case. We started this session with the opening words from WHO. I would like to close speaking from the regional perspective, from the European section of the WHO, and to reflect that in our region, the discussion and the work on environment and health has quite a long tradition. There is even a regional platform functioning for over 30 years now. And we have seen, and it's not unique to Europe, that this work on environment and health started from identifying threats, risks. It has been for long risk-based, risk-focused. We're looking into air pollution, water contamination, noise, etc., etc. And gradually, this recognition of the value of the benefits to health, physical health, mental health, and also social dimension of the good quality, well-maintained environment is coming into the picture. And this work on the associations, on the role of the green space for human health is part of this. It has, of course, many implications, including also a sense of, I would say, empowerment to people, that the environment that is surrounding us, we really need to take care of it for our, I would say, very selfish consideration of protecting our health, but seeing the value of it. We have heard today much about the relevance of green space to mental health. In the opening words, Natalie referred also to aging, so indeed to different aspects of health. And in fact, if we look at these priorities in public health globally, issues like mental health really come to the fore. And in fact, in 2018, during the UN high-level meeting on non-communicable diseases, mental health issues were added to the other priority diseases, non-communicable diseases that we have to cope with, like cardiovascular conditions, cancer, diabetes, and certain pulmonary conditions. And also, this high-level UN forum looked into the main risk factors for those conditions. And in addition to tobacco, alcohol, diet, lack of physical activity, also air pollution was added. And even from these keywords, you really can see the relevance of the good quality, well-maintained green space. This might be the environment conducive for physical activity. This might be the environment conducive to locally improved air quality. This is also the environment which is good for our mental health. Arndt mentioned, referred to COVID, and in fact, these past few months have added also to this value of green space, also in connection to mental health. On one hand, given the nature of the disease and transmission of virus, staying outdoors in open spaces becomes not only an opportunity, but it may be one of those few spaces where people can relax. And on the other hand, the COVID pandemic is not only the issue of the very infection, but also a huge mental, psychological stress to many. Thus, again, green spaces might offer a refuge. So it is really very multidimensional. Of course, the evidence is not complete, and we also have heard about several points where research is really needed to be continued to get even a better insight. But for sure, even with this level of knowledge that we have now, we really can act, and we really can use the argument of green space for the benefits of health and well-being more extensively, and to appreciate this value even more. And finally, I would like to say that with this increased recognition of the value of using green space, benefiting from green space to our health and well-being, it would also contribute to increased understanding and awareness of the value of nature at large for our health and well-being, hopefully also promoting this understanding of issues like biodiversity, like the well-functioning ecosystems, because still to many, these things seem purely environmental issues, disconnected from us, disconnected from our health, from our condition. And on the other hand, we know that protecting well-functioning ecosystems, stopping biodiversity loss is not only the environmental issue, but it's the very basic of our health and functioning as societies. So in the longer perspective, making it more clear and promoting the role of green spaces for human health may also be this avenue to better understanding of these more complex relationships between the nature, the ecosystems, and human health. So that's all from me, and wishing everyone interesting rest of the Congress. Thanks, and over to Tim.
Hey, thank you very much. Well, that was an excellent session, I have to say. I found it very fascinating. I've got a couple of quick questions here. For Pierre, the modelling, which I'm as you know, I'm very interested in your Green UR model, and you're planning the testing throughout 21. Would it be fair to say that we could see some results from that testing and perhaps some further demonstrations in Tirana 21?
Yes, well, WHO tools are built following a kind of procedure where you have basically the scientists gathering together and giving instructions and idea of on what to do. And then once we develop something, we have to go through a consensus meeting. But with the COVID, it's been really impossible to gather 40 or even more scientists to go through the work that we have done. So it was approved in a way or another because we are reproducing scientific results that were peer-reviewed in journals, and also we are pushing about the evidence. So I hope that in 1 year, when the situation will improve, we can follow the usual WHO standard kind of procedure and having scientific consensus meeting. But the phase of testing will go on. So I think we can get in touch. We cannot run many tests, but probably one just test due to our limited resources also can be done with you. And then next year we can plan a presentation. I think it was interesting for you to be exposed to very quickly to some of our work that we can present in a more articulated way with different sessions. Now it was really an hour, very dense.
Oh, look, absolutely. I must say, I'm sure everybody watching in would agree that 10 minutes on each of these subjects just whet our appetite to hear a lot more. So certainly we'd be interested to have you at future seminars and conferences. My next question, I guess, is a quick one to Arndt. You mentioned evergreen trees function better, and I certainly I'm fascinated in the work you're looking at going forward into specific species of trees. But I take it the evergreen is because they're active all year round and not bare in winter. Would that be correct?
Yes, Tim, that's correct. Plus, so in winter also there are often more particles in the air, so the function for reducing these particles is even more important in winter. So then deciduous trees there have a weakness, but also many of the evergreen trees, they have more of a wax layer, and particles can be trapped in this wax layer and then also trapped for a long time. And that also makes these evergreen trees more interesting. And there are studies that compare all different types of trees and plants in their potential. But there are so many factors that determine the final outcome that, evergreen versus deciduous is a very good guidance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And hopefully we can find a balance between the dense vegetation you require and the open vegetation that Fendt requires for the mental health. Natalie, would you like to have any closing comments? We've only got, we're pretty well time's up, but I do want to thank you all, and on behalf of World Urban Parks, and thank all our listeners or viewers, and we look forward to working with the World Health Organization in coming years.
Thanks, Tim. No additional points from my end, just to reinforce the message of all of us, to thanking you for the opportunity. This is a great platform, and I think this is just the start, of a long-term and collaboration. So thanks a lot for this opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you very much. If there's no other questions, I'll say goodbye to everybody and we'll end the session here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.